Hello friends, in today's video I'm giving you a quick overview of the Behringer 2600-VCO Eurorack module, and I will show you how to connect it to the Behringer MS-1 synthesizer to create some amazing sounds. So stay tuned. The Behringer 2600-VCO is an analog VCO module and an authentic reproduction of the original ARP 2600 circuitry that can fit in a standard Eurorack case. But since this video is intended to give you some inspiration to step outside of the regular box, I'm not using the 2600 VCO in a standard Eurorack setup. Instead, I will show you how to connect it to a monophonic synthesizer with an external audio input to boost and enhance the sound. Hello, this is Ralph Baumgartel. Please subscribe if you are new and like this video to see future updates. Thank you so much for your kind support. I have several monophonic synthesizers with an external audio input. The Arturia Microbrute, the Roland SE02, my beloved classic Oberheim OB1, and the Behringer MS-1. Each of these synthesizers gives external audio signals a very distinct and unique sound due to their individual VCF, VCA and envelope circuitry. In my personal opinion, the Behringer MS-1 and the 2600 VCO blend very well with each other. Please make sure you stick around until the end, where I will give you my final opinion about the 2600 VCO Eurorack module. And now, let's jump over to the Behringer MS-1 and the 2600 VCO. Alright, we are looking here at the 2600 VCO. For this tutorial we call this oscillator VCO number 1 and this oscillator we will call oscillator number 2. The 2600 VCO is built like VCO number 2 and 3 on the Behringer 2600, Behringer Grey Mini and Behringer Blue Marvin. The difference is, the only difference, that we have a fine-tune knob here instead of a slider on the Behringer 2600. And then also we do not have the option to sync the oscillators, because I guess these modules and oscillators are sold individually, and in order to make use of the sync option you require at least 2 VCOs. So I will be giving you a brief overview of the 2600 VCO here. I expect you to have some basic understanding about modular synthesizers and subtractive synthesis. If you need a beginner guide about the 2600 VCO and all the details, then kindly check out my beginner tutorial. I put the link to that video in the description below. So now let's start here with a brief overview. We have here the initial oscillator frequency. This is the tuning slider, and this knob here is the fine tune. Below you have the pulse width slider. You can set the width of the pulse. And then here you have a slider, a switch. In the upper position, it's in audio range mode. And if you slide it down, the oscillator is running in low frequency mode, and you can use it as an LFO. So let's move the slider up again. Here you have the keyboard CV input slot. And then here you have 3 input slots for frequency modulation, and then you have the corresponding sliders to adjust the input of the control voltage, modulating the frequency of the oscillator. And then finally here you have a control voltage input to modulate the pulse width. Okay, now let's move over to the Behringer MS-1. Here you can see I have a bunch of cables because I have prepared the setup to go more quickly through this tutorial. So this cable here, the brown cable, is the velocity out. The velocity out outputs a variable control voltage based on the velocity of the key pressed. Okay, then here, this is the CV out. I have connected a multiplier to this CV output because I want to use the control voltage on various locations of the 2600 VCOs. And then finally here we have the input, the audio input to the Behringer MS-1. You can see I have also connected a multiplier to that input because I want to input several waveforms into the Behringer MS-1. So now let's start patching this up. We get all the cables out of the way for the moment. And we start with the control voltage. Here, this green cable. And we plug it here into the keyboard CV input slot of oscillator number 1. So then we take one audio input here and plug it into the pulse wave output of oscillator number 1. So on the Behringer MS-1, I turn down the Behringer MS-1 VCO and I move up the slider for the external audio in. Now when I press a key, you can hear the oscillator number 1, the 2600 VCO. I change the width of the pulse. So this sound is just coming now from the 2600 VCO. So the next thing we are going to do is we take the velocity out, here this brown cable, and plug it here into the CV pulse wave modulation slot. I increase this slider a little bit, and now I press a key here on the keyboard. So you can hear how the sound changes slightly according to the speed of the key pressing. So the velocity of the key pressed is influencing the control voltage, which is influencing the pulse width modulation. The sound change is very, very subtle. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is that I also take here the sine wave output and run it into the Behringer MS-1. So this gives me a little bit more texture. That's the way how I perceive it. So if I output two waveforms, in my personal perception, the sound has a little bit more power, body, and texture. And now let's bring in the oscillator of the Behringer MS-1. This is just the Behringer MS-1 oscillator playing, and this is with the 2600 VCO. So let's add a little bit of delay. So in the next step we are going to use oscillator number 2 as an LFO to modulate the pulse width. So we unplug this here and move this slider downward. And now you can see I have already switched oscillator number 2 into LFO mode. We take the sine wave output and plug it here into the pulse width modulation slot. So I press a key here now on the keyboard of the Behringer MS-1. This is now just the 2600 VCO playing. And now I move up the slider, the pulse width modulation slider. And you can hear how the pulse width is modulated. Let's increase the speed of the LFO. This sounds about right. I'm introducing the VCO of the Behringer MS-1. This is just the Behringer MS-1, and now here with the 2600 VCO. With some delay again. So in the next step we are going to use here VCO number 2 as an additional sound source and also as a modulator to modulate the frequency of oscillator number 1. So for this we are going to take another CV out signal from the Behringer MS-1 and plug it here into the keyboard CV input slot of oscillator number 2. You may notice I have already moved this slider upward, that the oscillator now is running in audio mode. Okay, so then we take another audio input cable. This audio cable is running into the external input of the Behringer MS-1. And what are we going to use? We plug it here into the pulse wave output slot. Okay, so now when I press a key on the keyboard, you can hear both oscillators playing. I unplug oscillator number 2. You can hear only oscillator number 1. And now I plug it back into oscillator number 2, and now you hear both oscillators. Okay, so the next thing we are going to do is that we take here the sawtooth output of oscillator number 2 and plug it here into FM2 CV input slot of oscillator number 1. So I press the key on the keyboard. And now I increase the slider slightly. This sounds about right. Gives us a nice distorted sound. And now let's bring in the oscillator of the Behringer MS-1. Okay, this is just the Behringer MS-1 oscillator, and this now with the 2600 VCOs. And now let's add some reverb again. Okay, here is my final personal opinion about the 2600 VCO Eurorack module. I personally love the sound and its functionality. I was running the external 2600 VCO through my Behringer 2600, the Grey Mini and the Blue Marvin. In my perception, it sounds exactly like the built-in oscillators. Moreover, I like the fact that Behringer has swapped the fine-tuning slider for a fine-tuning knob. Personally, I think that makes minor fine-tuning adjustments a lot easier. The 2600 VCO is pretty stable. Even after turning it off for a couple of days, the oscillator was still holding its tune. Unlike the Behringer 2600, you cannot dim the LEDs on the 2600 VCO. Personally, this doesn't bother me too much, but I guess it would have been nice if Behringer had implemented this feature also on the 2600 VCO. Overall, the 2600 VCO is a nice, powerful sound source which I especially enjoy using together with my various mono synthesizers. If you guys enjoyed today's content, then please make sure to drop a thumbs up on this video to support the channel. And now, as always, thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you again in my next video. Until then, take care, stay safe, and peace.